All right. I am Ben Burgis. This is Give Them an Argument. I am joined, as I am once every few weeks, by Ethan of the Confronting Capital channel and also Academic Edgelords, and Victor Brazzone, who also does Academic Edgelords with Ethan and Matt McManus and Gordon Katic. So how are you guys doing tonight?
Pretty good. You know, still working through the revisions from my committee on my dissertation. That's like my focus, and it's this thing we have in Canada called a reading week. So just been spending that time, like a study week. I don't know.
Yeah. Like you do often have that at American universities, but I think only for finals, not for midterms. I'm not familiar. I don't think I've ever heard of that for midterms, but
for sure.
Yeah.
I'm doing pretty well. I just finished editing and uploading a video going over Vosh and Kyle's beef about the Houthis like 10 seconds before joining this stream.
Nice.
I mean, I could guess.
Yeah.
Okay. Right.
That's good. Do you still have COVID?
I have like a lingering cough still, but I'm like 99% better.
Nice.
Yeah. No, I actually have a, I remember at the end of the year, a good friend of mine, messaged me that she had COVID, and my like insensitive first response was to send that meme with the people hanging, the first time. It's like, yeah.
Is that your first time having it, Ethan, or no? Or sorry, second time at least, probably. Just second.
At least second. I have maybe had it 3 times. I don't even know.
Yeah, I've had it twice that I know for sure. Although I can't say I've actually tested every time. Like I've felt a little under the weather. I mean, I was definitely doing that in like 2021, but like at some point over the years, that's dropped off. Like so, it's not out of the question that there could have been a third mild case.
Yeah.
I had 3 confirmed, and I think it's only the 3 for me. Was the last time was like right when I was in LA, and I was supposed to meet up with you, Ben, and then we decided not to. But at that time, I did not know that I had COVID yet. But
yeah, that's right. You told me that you thought that the person you were staying with had COVID. That they
exactly.
And you hadn't tested positive. And I honestly, probably, yeah. I mean, it turned out that you did, so it's good. It's probably good that I did it. I will say, probably if I hadn't been like planning to see my parents that weekend, and I would have felt really bad if I'd given them COVID, I probably would have rolled the dice anyway. But
I mean, I didn't test positive till I got back to Toronto, so.
Yeah, it's hard to say though, because like part of the problem. I mean, the first time I had it, I had tested negative the morning of the day that I know 100% sure for sure that I gave it to 2 people, because I was like feeling a little off, and I tested and it was negative. I was like, yeah, okay, that's fine. This has happened 100 times before. I feel a little off. I tested, it's nothing. And then like the next day, I like very clearly had it, and then like the person, one of them was my ex-wife, so she would have gotten it from me at any time. But like the other person who I definitely gave it to, I hadn't had any contact with since then. And, so for sure I gave it to them then. But yeah, this is anybody who tuned in for a debate breakdown. We're not going to do that. We're just going to talk about health. That's, we're trying to replicate the experience of my that I would have when I would like hang out with my late grandmother and her sisters, and like that just spend 3 hours talking about their health problems. We're going to do our version of that.
So before you watch a Ben Shapiro debate with your grandmother, you just check up on her health.
Yeah, that is exactly what I'm saying. So the debate itself is Ben Shapiro, as you said, friend of the show, Benjamin Shapiro. So he is arguing with Alex O'Connor, who's the cosmic skeptic guy, about the stated topic is religion good for society. I saw I know I've seen like little snippets from this where they definitely touch on other issues that are peripheral to that about God and free will, and do you think that there's like like if you're a godless material, there's a persistent self and stuff like that. So I actually think because I actually think there should be quite a bit that's fun going on here, even though like I actually think there's a certain sense in which the question is religion good for society is like
Have you ever talked to Alex, Ben?
Not on air. I actually had dinner with him like I don't know, like 2 years ago at the Hay Festival. He the Hay on Why, the how the light gets in, that thing. He like sent me a message because he'd seen I was going to be there, and so we did end up like talking for a couple hours then. But yeah, never on air. We were going to do there had been some talk at one point. I actually think Ethan had suggested this, and somebody else maybe also had. Anyway, I have so there was talk at some point of doing a debate with him about free will, and then it just never happened. And I don't know. Maybe
sounds fun.
Maybe if he says stuff in the debate we're going to watch tonight that sparks it, I'll message him again and see if if we can make that happen.
Cool.
Well, let's get started.
Universally, social science suggests that many of the institutions that we hold dear, that shape us, that provide us social support, a huge amount of this used to happen anyway inside of these traditional religious structures, and there really has been nothing to replace it.
We're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms.
This show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online. So thanks again.
The arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. And I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
If people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here.
If you want more from today's conversation, register now and you'll have a chance to win a free ebook. And tell us who persuaded you in our survey with today's show. Welcome to The Big Conversation, part of Premier Unbelievable's roster of shows brought to you in partnership with the Templeton Foundation. I am your host, Andy Kind. Today, we are talking about a very interesting topic. The question is religion good or bad for society? And I've been joined by two very dapper chaps, Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor, who most of you maybe will be completely aware of.
So this is very funny, given our conversation just before we went on air about, me having a hard out at 11 EST and, how we're going to like wait long intervals. But I just wanted to say very quickly before we pause, make sure we got through this all, the main show and the post game tonight. But but I did just want to pause to say that like the Templeton Foundation thing is a little bit funny to me. Do you guys know what this is?
Oh yeah, for sure. When I was at Ryerson, now it's called Toronto Metropolitan University. When I did my master's in philosophy, we had like a fairly big name in philosophy of religion. This guy Klaus Cray, and I remember he was working on this big project about like whether not whether God exists, but whether like it matters whether God exists. And it was like somewhere, and I remember it like being like, oh, that's kind of like, I don't know. Obviously, I was just like, that sounds boring, and like, and then someone told me, oh, he's getting like $100,000 from the Templeton Foundation to do that, and then that's when I learned what it was. It's just like this. They tend to fund a lot of like now I guess free speech things, but like they give a lot of money. They do give a lot of money to a lot of different things that have to do with philosophy, but a lot of it, like the big stuff in philosophy of religion, is like Templeton Foundation stuff. Yeah,
I actually wasn't even aware that they did other things. All I ever remember them for, and granted, this is all stuff from like 10 years ago, when I was, most kind of around academics, but like all the stuff I was ever aware of them from was all the philosophy of religion. And like, it always really struck me as kind of funny right? That like, so you have various kinds of libertarian like think tanks and centers, some of which will throw around money to like endow chairs in departments, will throw around money to bring people to conferences, get people to write papers for them. And then you have the Templeton thing doing a little bit of the same thing on the religion beat. And I just remember having the thought when I was in grad school, I was like, man, if I were either a theist or a libertarian, I'd feel very strange about the fact that these seem to be the only two philosophical positions where there's all this money sloshing around for anybody who's willing to take them seriously.
Yeah.
Totally. I remember when Matt and I, for Plastic Pills, talked to Matt Sitman from Know Your Enemy. I remember he told us all about how when he was a young conservative academic at the University of Virginia, like the amount of money floating around for conservative intellectuals was like absurd. And he'd get invited to these like fancy parties and with like Patrick Deneen and, you know, George P, whatever his last name is, like that guy, I forget what his last name is, but like all the conservative academics. And he was just like, you know, I could have stayed and like I'd be doing so much better financially because like they love a conservative academic. And I'm sure the Templeton Foundation is probably somehow has its hand in it, but he didn't actually mention them by name, at least if I remember.
Yeah. Again, I don't know if that's exactly the kind of thing they do, but yeah, there's tons of that. Like I would, you know, I just
like libertarian stuff, like the Kochs fund a bunch of stuff, like the like Civil Liberties Society, like the stuff at George Mason University that like they'll pay you to go to these seminars and like
well, right, like Mercatus.
Mercatus, exactly.
Yep, totally. No, look, I mean, all this stuff. Yeah, I've talked to Matt Sitman about that before because I remember a long time ago I was messaging him like anyway, I barely remember what it was about, but but I remember telling him then that what I did, you know, about like how, you know, I just done the Charlie Kirk debate and I was telling him about how strange it was to like see like what a striking contrast it was to my entire experience of left media, right? You know, just to see like the, you know, Turning Point USA building where we did the debate, you know, it's like the, you know, Turning Point USA, big marquee on the outside of the building, sliding glass doors, green room, you know, it says Turning Point USA in the bathrooms, right? And that got him talking about all the, you know, like, I mean, he was, you know, whatever. I mean, that's Turning Point USA is definitely the beer track and he was definitely the wine track, you know, but like, you know, his experience of sort of conservative money. And yeah, they love intellectuals. Like you know, I mean, it is really funny. I mean, I guess maybe it's something to think about, right? Like whatever leftist you hate the most, and, you know, you're always, you know, like people love calling each other grifters, but it's like, man, I could, you know, if I had an epiphany tomorrow and decided that I actually believed in God and love free markets, my life would be so much better, right? Like,
well, it makes sense too, like, because when I kind of think like, okay, what are like in the context of like philosophy or politics, like what are the worst arguments I've ever heard? It seems like they're all like libertarian and theist arguments. Like you know, like you have like argumentation ethics and like the modal ontological argument, and it's like, yeah, there has to be lots of funding for this to be taken seriously, you know?
Yeah, no, it definitely helps. So Antonio in the chat said, is Alex O'Connor a lefty or is this another Alien versus Predator? He's like at least a lib, right?
That's yeah, he seems kind of like left wing, but not like a leftist, probably.
Yeah, like maybe if he were an American, he would have voted for Elizabeth Warren. You know, that's
right.
Yeah, I don't, you know, I mean, he's certainly not a conservative or anything close to one, right?
Yeah,
or
for sure.
libertarian or anything like that, right? You know, whether he's quite like a leftist, I don't know about that, but yeah, you know, certainly I suspect for this topic that the difference isn't going to make a big difference, but we will find out.
We're going to have a very substantive conversation. I'm going to introduce them first. I'm going to give a little summary on who they are, and stop me if you've heard this before. So Ben Shapiro is a prominent American conservative political commentator and columnist. Okay, so far?
So far, so good.
A graduate in political science from UCLA and the Harvard Law School, Ben has authored over a dozen books, including the #1 New York Times bestseller, The Right Side of History: How Reason and Moral Purpose Made the West Great. He is co-founder and editor emeritus of The Daily Wire and host of the aptly titled Ben Shapiro Show, which in 2021 was ranked in the top 10 most listened to Apple podcasts. He also has a YouTube channel with over 6 million subscribers.
Jeez,
Kudos
that's
to you,
depressive.
Joining Ben today is Alex O'Connor. Alex O'Connor is a YouTuber and host of the Within Reason podcast, a philosophy platform designed to present philosophical discussions in an accessible format. A graduate of philosophy and theology from St. John's College, Oxford University, he is also an international public speaker and debater, having defended his philosophical convictions against a wide range of experts across multiple continents, and whose online video material has been viewed more than 70 million times. Is that true?
It might be more now, actually, depending on
more
when
than 70 million times.
that was written.
Yeah, that's great. Well, it's great to have you both. Thank you both for taking the time. And for both of you, I'm a long-time listener, first-time caller. So hopefully we're going to have a lot of good stuff to say. We're talking about religion and society and how they interconnect. And we want to know, really, and I'd like to get this settled once and for all at the end of this conversation so nobody else ever has to discuss it if we can. Is religion good for society? Can a society hold together if there are no underlying beliefs that everybody shares? And we're going to be exploring what both of you believe are the most important principles undergirding any civilization. What are the foundations of morality and ethics based on? So without further ado, let's start. I'm not going to go into backstory too much because most people will be aware of who you are. And there'll be a lot of fanboys and girls out there watching. But let's talk about something that, Ben, you have spoken on, and Alex, you have responded to, this idea of the atheist delusion. Ben, could you sort of concisely, if you can, talk about what you mean by the atheist delusion?
Sure. So I should start off by saying I don't actually think that it's possible to prove the existence of God. I'm also not a believer that you can disprove the existence of God. I don't think that logical argumentation is going to get you there one way or another. And so I'm not going to try and do that with Alex today, because I think that if people would have been able to provide dispositive proofs, then people would believe them. And if people were able to provide dispositive proofs that God does not exist, then people would be more apt to believe those as well. What I think is an atheist delusion is that it is possible to live ideologically purely in a way that does not rely on fundamental faith principles. When I say faith principles, I'm not going to make the claim that those faith principles are direct from Sinai or that those faith principles require the New Testament, for example. I'm going to make the claim that there are a bunch of principles upon which we base ourselves that are external to what we know about nature and evolutionary biology. And that many of the things that Alex does in his daily life, for example, are going to be things that rely on principles that are external to a philosophy that would assume a lack of the supernatural, a lack of the extra natural. So some of those principles, for example, are free will. So every day we get up, we believe, virtually all of us, whether we say we believe it or not, we actually act in ways that betray the idea that we believe that we have control over our own actions, at least to a certain extent, and that control makes a difference in the world. And that's what gives us purpose. It's what allows us to wake up in the morning and make the decision to do what we believe is right or what we believe is wrong. That the principles of right and wrong are external to evolutionary biology. So both of these principles that I've mentioned already, free will, right and wrong, these come from a language that is external to the Darwinian language of evolutionary biology. If you're talking about free will, there is nothing in nature that suggests the ability to make a decision free of environment and genetics in combination in some sort. The same thing is true of right and wrong. The idea that there is a right and there is a moral wrong that we can reason our way to. Another principle that I think that you're obviously very big on, it's something that you rely on all the time. Your entire podcast is based on the idea of reason. These ideas do not exist in the context of a purely materialist atheist universe. Now, I'm not going to make the claim that I can prove that it's God who's behind those things, because one of the principles of faith belief is that I don't understand God. So for people who don't believe in God, that's an easy way out, right? That's an easy way out for people like me, because I say, well, I don't have to explain the relationship between God and free will, because frankly, I don't fully understand God. But that's not really that's not really an open window. That's just part of pretty much all faith systems, is that if my mind were the mind of God, then I would either be God or God would not exist, one of the two things. So the idea that reason makes a difference in our lives, that we can reason our way to propositions, and that's more than just saying a few magic words and that's setting off a few neurons in somebody else's brain, in a naturalistic way, that there actually is principles of truth, another concept that comes from the extra natural world, that these principles exist. So far I've mentioned free will, good, right and wrong, reason, and truth, right? All things that we consider extremely key in our daily lives, and that Alex considers key in what he does. It's, I assume, why you get up every morning, or at least why you feel you get up every morning. You know, what gets you up to do your podcast? It's because you want to say things that you believe are reasonable, are going to convince people to act in a better way, or I assume not a worse way, that get people to change their lives in some way in a self-motivated fashion. That's not merely in a sort of Pavlovian response to circumstance and environment. So if I were going to talk about the atheist delusion, that's what I would suggest is the delusion, that an atheist can use terminology that is drawn from a world that is external to atheism for itself. And again, that's not an argument for God even. That's just an argument against atheism. Again, I think the arguments against God are fairly compelling, and I think the arguments against atheism are fairly compelling. This is one of the things that I've said to Sam Harris. And I think that the difference is that most people who believe in God have expressed doubts, and a lot of people who are atheists tend to be more religious in this way than many of the people who are God believers.
Well, something's certain. We don't do cold opens or soft starts here on the big conversation. Alex.
Well, I am glad to begin on a point of agreement with you, Ben, that yes, if there is no God, there is no free will. But I think that's because of the truth of the latter of those statements. That I suppose the biggest criticism that I made of you in a video response that I made to the atheist delusion, and this show does seem to have an extraordinary capacity for putting me face to face with people that I've been talking smack about online. So thanks again.
By the way, I should say it's a great video, and everybody should watch it if they haven't.
Well, I'm going to put that in the description. I think that glowing endorsement. The principal disagreement that I think I had with you, Ben, is that there was a subtle or not so subtle implication in my view that yes, with no God, there's no free will, but somehow having God can solve this problem. I mean, you said a moment ago that you don't think you can establish God's existence through reason alone, but assuming that you do believe in the existence of free will, you think it's a real thing that you have.
Yes.
And simultaneously saying that if there is no God, then free will makes no sense.
Yes.
That does read to me like an argument for God's existence, such that in order to either say that there is free will, in order to say that there is free will, one must believe in God. And that does strike me as an argument for God's existence.
I mean, to slightly curve that, or to kind of sand off the rough edges there, I would say that the argument I made is an argument for something extra natural.
Sure.
Now, you can call that God or not God, but the thing that I'm making the argument for is that you cannot get from a materialist Darwinist universe to free will. That is not possible. So I know that the way you solve that is that you say that there is no free will.
That's right.
And what I'm saying to you is you don't act that way.
I hear this all the time. People say, look, you may say there's no free will, but you don't act as though that's the case. I suppose that I'm just confused as to what it would look like for somebody to act as if they believe there was no free will. I mean, the very argument that there is no free will that I subscribe to, at least one of the various forms that it takes, is a sort of Schopenhauerian view that you can do as you will, you just can't will what you will. And that you are essentially just a biological machine reacting to its internal and evolutionary drives. That's what's happening. Now, call that nihilistic if you like, that's a separate question. But as to the question of how this would make one act, the idea that this might cause us to sort of lay around in bed all day or something, the very mechanism that I think is responsible for eliminating the possibility of free will, that is, the drives that make people do what they do, like I say, do exactly that. Make people do what they do. They make them get out of bed in the morning. Why do you get out of bed and go and make your breakfast if there's no free will? So you go and get breakfast because there's no free will and something is driving you to do that that's outside of your control.
For sure. So to get back to the nihilism point, which you kind of put aside, so that means that this conversation is essentially worthless in any sort of real sense. I mean, effectively, we were driven here by evolutionary biology and environment to have this conversation. Everybody who's watching this is driven by evolutionary biology and environment to have a particular reaction to that thing, and ever round the cycle goes. That seems like a very purposeless life. Maybe again, I'm drawing from a realm that is not evolutionarily
Okay. I've got many things to say, but let's start with you guys.
Yeah, I mean, I also have like a lot of things to say about what Ben said in particular, a little bit Alex as well. But one like broad kind of issue is that Ben Shapiro keeps saying like, oh, well, there are these principles that inform how we live that are external to naturalistic philosophy. And, you know, like, I guess like most charitably, he's saying that like we invoke all of these concepts, and he doesn't think there's any sort of like suitable reductionist account for any of them on like a naturalistic worldview. And, but, you know, it's like, and, you know, you can dispute that obviously, but it's also just like, you know, I thought we were talking about like religion and God, not like, is naturalism false? You know, like there are plenty of non-naturalistic, non-religious, non-theist worldviews. It seems really weird to kind of come to a debate about religion and theism and just start saying like, you know, naturalism itself isn't enough. I don't know.
Yeah, because this is something you see all the time in this context. I mean, it reminds me of God, back in 2021, I think I'd done this debate with Douglas Wilson, who, if people don't know who that is, that's like a mega church pastor, written a bunch of books, used to debate Hitchens and stuff like that. And like he, you know, he's like very, very fond of this same move, right? That this is sort of like, well, you know, you can't give like a, you know, you can't give this like purely physical explanation of X. Therefore, or even just there's like some sort of doubt or philosophical controversy about how to make sense of X. Therefore, X only makes sense given the existence of God. It's like, well, no, I mean, you like, you know, even if you've established the first thing, you're at best halfway and really a lot less than that to doing it. You know, you still have to show how adding God to this picture is going to help you make sense of it. And like, it just seems like people who are fond of this kind of argument almost never bother to do that. They just sort of take it as obvious that like, you know, oh, if God exists, then like any concept that would otherwise be hard to make sense of, like just immediately comes into clarity. It's like, well, why, how, right? Like spell it out for me. Give me the steps.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's, you know, it's like, it's very strange. Like there's, you know, like, you know, I wouldn't opt for these views, but like, I mean, you could be an atheist, say there's no God, I'm not religious, etc., and believe in like souls and libertarian free will and like non-natural moral properties and like platonic objects. Like you can have like a very like, you know, supernatural ontology while leaving out the God part. And it's like in many of these cases, like you kind of gestured at, like it's not clear like what work God would even do. You know, like you know, like the moral case obviously is like most famous with like, you know, this like Euthyphro problem, where it's like, you know, you just, you know, they'll just say like, okay, well, how do you make sense of normativity on naturalism? And, you know, it's just kind of assumed that, well, if you add theism, then there's not a problem. But it's just like, you know, it's not clear why that would be the case.
Yeah, right. Like it doesn't seem like adding theism is relevant at all, right? You know, which that, you know, because if, you know, I mean, if the reason it's supposed to be relevant is, oh, the, you know, what morality comes from is the will of God, then you have the classic Euthyphro problem that, well, hold up, is, you know, does God, you know, want you to do good things because they're good, in which case you've abandoned the idea that the will of God is what makes things good, or is anything God happens to will good? So if God willed you, you know, if God, you know, commanded you to, you know, rape and pillage and, you know, and torture people for fun, then that would be good. And of course, what any remotely normal religious believer would think when they hear that is, well, God wouldn't command you to do those things because those are awful and God is good. But of course, then you've just abandoned the premise that God's will is is the foundation of morality, which is like, it's not just something smarmy atheists say. I mean, this has also convinced many theists who are like serious philosophers that, oh, wait a second, divine command and ethics doesn't actually make sense, does it? Right. So they still think that God is morally perfect and God wants you to do good things, but they'll sort of abandon the idea that, you know, that the God does some sort of work in making metaethics make sense and telling you what right from wrong is. And at least in there, like at least in that case of morality, it's like relatively clear what the connection is supposed to be, even if it doesn't really make sense for these reasons that have been like well understood since ancient Greece. That, whereas like in the case of free will, I have no idea what the connection is supposed to be, right? Like how is it, like you could, on the face of it, I mean, look, divine determinism could be as much of a problem for free will as any other kind of determinism. You could say God willed the universe to be, in whatever way you think it would have to be for us to have free will. But you could equally say that the universe happens to be that same way, right? Whatever way you think that is, would have to have free will. I mean, this is what you were getting at, I take it. Like you could equally say that it just happens to be in that state without God having made it that way, right? Like that seems totally logically compatible. It's not even clear, what the conceptual connection is supposed to be between those things. And then the third one, right? He actually helpfully repeated himself and like summarized what he'd said, right? He said one, free will and right or wrong. And then he said reason and truth and principles of truth. And there I just get even more
truth. I've never even heard that one floated by like theists that like you can't have a good theory of truth without God. It's like, what?
No, I've never heard that one either, and I've heard some strange ones. Like I did debate a couple of years ago with this guy Stuart Nechtel, who like has this bizarre argument I've never heard anybody else make, that you need God in order to make sense of like language or like how like words like mean things. But like even him, I never heard say that you need it for truth or reason, right? Like I'm just like, okay, ethics, I understand like what the connection is supposed to be. I just don't think it makes sense once you kind of press on it. I think Plato's right? Like that, like free will, it gets a little bit more confusing what the connection's supposed to be, right? Because it seems like, again, however you think God would have made the universe such that we have free will, you could think that the universe is that way, right? Like it's not, just like it could be the way it is. Yes, a God who wanted us to have free will could make it that way. A God who wanted us to not have free will could have not made it that way. But like this seems like the real underlying question is whether the universe itself is whatever way it would have to be. And then like, truth and reason, I'm just totally lost because it's like I can't even argue against it because I don't understand what the connection's supposed to be.
Well, I mean, God makes everything that's good, and truth is good. Therefore, you have to have God.
Yeah, fair enough.
Another like, sorry.
No, you go.
Another like kind of strange thing that was said about free will is like Ben Shapiro is like in nature, just like given like naturalistic resources and evolutionary biology and whatnot, there's no reason to think that we could make decisions in a way that's like not just determined by genetics and environment. But like to say that like that's proof that you can't believe in free will as a naturalist kind of just begs the question against compatibilism, which is like the mainstream view on free will among atheists. Because like the whole point is that a lot of atheists are going to give accounts of free will where having free will is completely consistent with your decisions being entirely determined by genetic and environmental considerations.
Yeah. I mean, this is, of course, the thing that I found most frustrating about this first 10 minutes of the debate, that compatibilism, despite, as you say, probably being the majority view among academic philosophers, and like, even if you don't know anything about academic philosophy, fair enough, not everybody needs to, but it's like, come on, even if you just know your popular atheism, right? One of the four horsemen is Daniel Dennett, who's also like a leading compatibilist, right? So, and has written tons about it, right? So, so the fact that like, it's just kind of a frustrating artifact of O'Connor's views that like, that compatibilism is just entirely unaccounted for in this conversation as an option, right? Because I mean, it seems like the closest that Ben Shapiro came to giving some sort of definition or implicit definition of free will. He said something like that, you're free from, right, genetics and environment, which of course would be a very incompatibilist, definition. So, I mean, just really, really quickly for anybody who's not familiar with this debate, I mean, like if you, like I think the closest you could get to a sort of consensus-y definition of free will is, in other words, one that both compatibilists and incompatibilists might nod along to, is to say that whatever kind of control you think we have to exercise over our actions in order for us to be responsible for those actions, right? That's what free will is. And then the debate is going to be about, well, what kind of control is it that we need to exercise over our actions to be responsible for them? And presumably what Ben and Alex both think is that it would have to be some sort of like spooky, magical kind of control that maybe you would need an immaterial soul for, that would like require it to be the case that even given every single detail of the causal backstory of the world and all the laws of physics, that it could still go different ways. And like the thing that would make it go different ways wouldn't just be like a neurological coin flip. It would be something that's not determined and not random. And that gets like more and more mysterious the more you think about it, right? That's like one account of what kind of control that you would need. But like there are other accounts of what kind of control you would need. They're like, well, you have a sufficiently reasons responsive cognitive mechanism that you have like a certain set of capacities for understanding and being at least somewhat moved by reasons for and against different courses of action. And there's obviously tons of stuff you can say on both sides of that, but it is just like, as you say, it's really frustrating that I think maybe Alex, who's presumably heard of this, has just decided that that this is just such a dead end that he's not going to bring it up. And it's entirely possible that Ben Shapiro just doesn't even know that like the other position exists.
Just the last thing real quick. I noticed that Dr. Smurfo in the chat, I think made a good point, which I think is like what I'm predicting is going to be frustrating about, or like just kind of non-productive about this debate. And also just looking at the title of the debate, by the way, it's like, is religion good for society? Right. And then immediately they get into like a different question, right? Which is, and then of course, what Smurfo in the chat is saying, Ben couldn't explain, like Shapiro couldn't explain the relationship between free will and God because he couldn't fully comprehend God. And I feel like anytime he's going to get pushed into a question, he's going to be like, what do you mean? Like God, I can't, I'm just a human. I can't presume to comprehend God, which is a similar kind of retreat as like, well, it's a question of faith, right? Eventually when they get pushed far enough, right? So it's just going to end up being like, why even debate this? Because it's like, your answer is going to be like, I can't comprehend God. And it's ultimately a matter of faith. As soon as you get pushed into any kind of corner, it's just waste of time.
Well, but it's also, if you're going to say that, fuck it. Just get rid of the middleman. Why not just have faith that we have free will and like leave God out of it?
Well, exactly.
Yeah. It's like, like the naturalists can say, well, I just don't really understand the nature of it. And it is what it is. Like, it's like, it is kind of, it is kind of weird that like, Ben Shapiro is like, I can't actually explain the connection between God and these concepts, but what do you want me to do? That's how God works. And it's like, okay, like he uses that as like a defense, but it's like, okay, that just means you came to the debate with like a necessarily, in your view, explanatorily impotent position when your whole argument is atheists can't explain X, Y, and Z. Like it just, I don't know. I don't get it.
Yeah, totally. Like if you're going to say like, oh, the nature like of God is that I don't understand anything about God. It's like, okay, fair enough. But like, if so, you certainly can't use God to explain anything. Cause like you'd have to know stuff about God in order to, in order for that explanation to make sense. That it's like, and this is also a problem, I think some of what Ben is at least edging onto the borders of here is, is a position called skeptical theism, which says that why would God allow X, Y, and Z that doesn't seem like a just God would allow? Well, God's reasons are mysterious to me. It's in fact, we should just expect our puny human minds not to be able to comprehend the infinite mind of God, which is kind of fair enough as far as it goes. But the problem is it's always a double-edged sword, because it's like, well, okay, if that's true, you can't know anything about what God would do. Then it's like, you can't know that God would want you to have free will, right? You can't know, like, because like you can't like make any of you can't say, the world being the way it is evidence for the existence of a God, because all of that stuff assumes that you know stuff about God, right? Like if it's a huge mystery, it's got to be a huge mystery consistently, right? Otherwise, you don't just get to pull that out when it's convenient. But yeah, I think I have what Victor's raising. We'll get back to it, but I have kind of mixed feelings about, because on the one hand, I think it is kind of a bad sign that like in the first couple minutes they're already on this, stuff that seems tenuously, if at all, related. But on the other hand, I'm almost kind of happier about that, because it's like I don't know. I always find it really frustrating when I see debates that are like framed in this terms, like this sort of like consequentialist, like, does religion do more good or harm kind of terms. Cause it's like, I don't know. I mean, how do you even go about adjudicating something like that? Right. Like as the, and it's always really unclear to me what the ground rules would be to decide something like that. Right. Like I think, I don't believe in a God, but that's just because like I try to not believe in stuff that I think probably isn't true, right? But like I don't know, like, is it more good than bad overall? I mean, it's certainly not good for society if people are like violent theocratic fundamentalists, but like, like if people, if people believe in God and they have like very peace and lovey ideas about what God wants, right? Like, is that worse for society than what, it's just, and there's so many variations that you could have of like both. I don't know. It's very like, I would have like I wouldn't do a conversation where this was the topic. Cause it's like my position is just, I have no idea. And I just don't even see why. Like that's an interesting question, right? Like that we like what we like. Presumably, that's not how we think about anything else. That like any other interesting topic. That like first we decide whether it would be more beneficial if people believed it was true, and then we convince ourselves of it. Right? We could just skip to like talking about whether it's true.
Yeah, I agree with that. And it's also like, I guess just like one last thing on what you were saying before, which is like on the skeptical theism thing. It's like, I agree with you that like one problem is that, okay, if you're just going to say, well, how can we know what God would do? How can we even make any predictions about that? It's like, okay, well, then you just lose your ability to explain any data and like have any evidence for your theory. But then it arguably goes even deeper, which is like, especially if Alex is gonna, or not Alex, if Ben's gonna come out here and say like, okay, well, God is needed to ground things like our ability to reason and understand the truth, blah, blah, blah. It's like, I don't see why believing in skeptical theism wouldn't just like lead you to a general skepticism of like, like the external world and everything else. Cause it's like, if we're just going to say, how can we even know what God would do? Then like, why would we expect God not to deceive us systematically about all of these things?
Yeah. Yeah. Really good question. Right. Cause if you're going to say, oh, God wouldn't do that because God is good. It's like, well, hold on now.
Right.
Now we're in the business of thinking that we could know what a perfectly good being would do, right? Like, given infinite knowledge, etc. And if we can assume that, then the problem of evil is back on the table. But like if what such a being would do is so mysterious, the problem of evil is off the table, then yeah, totally. Like, yeah, why wouldn't God just systematically deceive us about everything, right? It's like we wouldn't do that, but like but that's just because we have our puny finite minds don't understand all the wonderful reasons it would actually be good to systematically deceive people.
Biologically connected. The word purpose is really, teleology obviously has been taken out of the realm of science pretty thoroughly by atheists and by many people in the sciences, although I would argue that, again, most scientists speak in the realm of teleology literally all the time, and they're borrowing language from the language of teleology, even when they're describing functions of particular body parts, right? The heart pumps blood in order to keep you alive, right? They're constantly using language that's teleological in nature. The real question that I have, and this is what goes to the question that you were asking at the beginning, before the sort of pre-question question, which was the good of religion to society. One of those goods is people believing that their free will matters and this actually is a useful thing. So I believe that it is deeply important for people in society to believe that they have the capacity to change themselves and to make different decisions than what biology would drive them to do. So you say, well, it's biology that drives you to get out of bed in the morning, which is almost Calvinist in sort of the way that it's described, right? It's like you're predestined to get out of bed in the morning, so thus you get out of bed in the morning. But the reality is that we are constantly making decisions as though those decisions make a difference in the universe. And what social science actually does tend to show is that when people believe that they have control over their own acts, and when they believe that they're capable of changing the way that they live, they do make those changes with more alacrity and in better directions than if they don't believe that. If people tend to believe in a deterministic universe, they do act worse. So it may work. This is going to be sort of Straussian in its implications, but that may work for you. You're a very high IQ individual who can somehow reconcile the idea of living a very purposeful life with the idea that actually there's no purpose to anything. But for the vast majority of people, that is not actually how they live. And I would suggest that even in your daily life, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, man, my biology is driving me this morning to get on the bike, have a great day. The sun is shining. That's my biology doing this. And I don't think that most people who live purposeful lives, even if they believe that everything they're doing is predetermined by the world around them, by their own biology, I don't believe they actually feel that. They have to engage in what they themselves would term an illusion in order to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in their lives.
Of course, but that's what the evolutionary process, in my view, in my worldview, I should say, has done so well, is provide precisely that illusion. I mean, it's not as that, I mean, you say, look, you don't get out of bed in the morning thinking, gosh, look at my biological
My neurons are
drive.
firing, yeah.
Of course not, because if I did, then the whole evolutionary purpose that this illusion serves would fall away. I mean, you say that this is a fairly purposeless life, and perhaps the implication is that it's a bit of a depressing one. I didn't come here to inspire optimism in people. I just think it is in fact the case.
By the way.
It is in fact the case that free will doesn't exist, and we may feel very nihilistic towards that, but as a wise man once said, facts don't care about your feelings. And I will say that the argument against free will, in my view, is based upon something broader than just scientific analysis or empirical research. Rather, we can build an argument, I think, from a law of logic, the proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can't be both, it can't be neither. It has to be one or the other. Now, this law of the excluded middle, one of the foundational precepts of philosophy, we can simply ask a question of any kind of mental activity, and this will be regardless of whether it's material or immaterial. That's what makes this a crucial argument, and an important one, a pertinent one, is that you can ask of that mental activity, is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random, and you're by definition not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind or inside your brain or indeed inside your soul, or it's determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, I should say yourself rather than your brain here to rid this conversation of any implicit materialism, exterior to yourself, if that's what's determining the action, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself somewhere, then all you do is push the problem back and you ask the question again, is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? So indeterminate, it's random. Determined, you keep going back until you either terminate in something outside of the self, something, or I suppose something undetermined and therefore random, either of which you are completely out of control in. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, people like to do this. They say, well, look, with a religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul. That doesn't solve anything. Because you still need to, it's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery. But if it is the case that whatever it is that's doing that is either determined or it's not, and that if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control, and that if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, and both of which are out of your control, free will cannot exist.
Well,
and so I would be careful.
That argument does rely on the complete deconstruction of the self. Right? I mean, you're using the term self in this argument in, I think, a couple of different ways. You're saying something outside yourself, but then you're breaking down the self into a bunch of separate components as though the self is a computer. Right? As though if you took the self and you broke it down into a machine, and there's like the microchip, and you've got the processor, you got all these different parts of it. So it has to be coming from here, or it has to be coming from here. But I think the very idea that we have of ourselves as selves is as a deciding being. And so the attempt to carve that down into, so which parts of the deciding being, that is an avoidance strategy. So I don't think that the argument quite holds.
Well, if we can call the self just a deciding being,
call it a deciding being,
then that sort of fundamental assumption that we make about the nature of the self, I don't think is going to be incompatible with atheism.
How so?
Because we're talking about what the self is here. I mean, atheists believe in the self. Everybody believes in the self.
Well, no, that's not. I mean, that I find difficult to believe. Why would an atheist believe in the self? The self is a series of non-deciding mechanisms, as you've described. I see that your view of the self is an atheist view of the self, a meatball wandering through space, as I've put it somewhat colorfully, the sort of Spinoza idea that you're a stone that's been thrown, and you can comprehend that you've been thrown, but you're a stone that's been thrown, and that's just the way that it is. why would there be in atheist philosophy such a thing as a deciding self? The deciding being is external to the idea of an evolutionary cause, because the very word deciding suggests uncaused decision making, and you've just excluded it through your own philosophy.
Uncaused decision making, I suppose, is a concept that I think is unintelligible, and therefore, if there is an unintelligibility of the self on atheism, I suppose the thrust of the criticism that I made to essentially every point you made in that video, except for the argument from motion, is that what you're saying to me, if it applies to atheism, I think simultaneously applies to theism as well.
How so?
An uncaused decision. I mean, what is the process by which a decision is made?
But now you're falling into the same sort of argument that I excluded at the beginning, which was, I said that the beauty of religion is that there's a bunch of stuff I don't understand. So I can't explain to you how the uncaused self makes decisions.
Well, then I can't explain to you how the uncaused self exists on an atheist.
But you have a
framework.
burden and I don't. Meaning that
I don't think that's the case.
You do, though. I mean, the simple fact is that you are the one who's claiming that a reasonable materialist universe is the cause of all. And so if that's the case, you do have to explain the mechanism in a way that I certainly do not. My entire philosophy rests on the positing of an entire realm of things I don't understand in terms of their interaction with the world. Now, as I said at the very beginning, that leaves me a giant escape hatch. I'm not going to pretend that that's not a giant escape hatch. It acts in practice as a giant escape hatch. It also tends to act as a fundamental principle of faith, right? Again, in every moral realm, right? When you get to the problem of good and evil, right? One of the big questions is, well, how can God allow evil to take place in the world? And the fundamental religious answer, as it has been for thousands of years, is my mind is not God's, which is a giant escape hatch. It also happens to be true from a religious point of view.
So if I may, that there are two sort of escape hatches here. There are two appeals to mystery going on here. And it seems to me that what you're saying is something along the lines of my simple appeal to mystery here is disallowed in the way that you're allowed to appeal to this mystery because I'm the one making the claim. I think that
not because I'm the one making the claim, but because
I'm the one with the burden. In the context of this discussion,
sorry, I'm missing the who's the you and who's the I in
yes.
a sense, but yes.
I see what you mean. I'm speaking for myself there.
Sorry.
If in the context of this discussion, this began the subject which I think is the first one you bring up in this video, free will. Here's this thing that I think exists, and on the basis of its existence, think entails the existence of a God, or at least points to the existence of a God. I shouldn't say entail. And then when I say that I don't think that the concept of free will is intelligible, and you say, well, how is it intelligible on atheism? And I say, I'm not sure it is, but it's not on theism either. And you say, well, there's my escape hatch. I can appeal to mystery. I don't think the burden is on me there. I think you were the one who's making the claim that free will does exist, that there is this mysterious property of the universe
actually, that's not
escapes this determined or indetermined dichotomy. And then when I say that this is unintelligible to me, and based on what I see to be fundamentally appeal to a law of logic, suddenly I'm the one making the claim. I'm the one with the burden who has to do the proving.
No, the actual claim that I originally made, if you recall, was a conditional claim.
Mm-hmm.
I did not claim free will exists, therefore God. I claimed if you believe free will exists, it cannot exist in a materialist universe. Now, you say, okay, fine, it doesn't exist in a materialist universe. I don't believe in free will.
Yes.
That's fine. That's totally plausible. As I said right at the top here,
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to prove to you that God exists today. What I am going to say is that the vast majority of people throughout nearly all of human history have believed there is a thing called a self. It is a deciding self that makes these decisions. If you are a person who believes that, you're right. It can't exist in your world. So I'm not saying that it does exist. Maybe it doesn't. Maybe you're right. Maybe you're totally right. And all of this is just a series of chemical firings. That's quite plausible. That's fine. What I have said, and this is the argument that hasn't yet been rebutted, is that society does require an extraordinary number of people to believe that they are capable of making decisions for the good or for the bad. Because again, not everybody is you. Not everybody is capable of waking up in the morning, putting one half of their brain on hold, the side that says what I'm doing today doesn't matter, and we are all going to wind up in the cosmic nothingness of space anyway, and the sun's going to explode and eat the earth. Most people don't function that way. And so a functional society, a society that actually works, relies on people actually believing that their fate is in their hands. And the way that people tend to understand that on a day-to-day level is, I get up in the morning and I make a decision whether I'm taking my kids to school today. I get up in the morning and I decide whether I'm giving charity today. I get up in the morning and I decide whether to go to a job today. Because the truth is that for a huge number of people, and I would say this is true for not virtually all, many, I would say the majority of people, if they were informed since the time they were small that their decision-making process does not exist, there is no decision to be made. Whatever's going to happen is going to happen. Those decisions have no moral weight in the universe because the universe has no moral weight. there is no way to create a functional society on the basis of these premises. There may be a Platonic world where philosophers, can think about this in the gardens of their imagination and feel great about it. But that's not actually how society functions, not for children, not for teenagers, not for adults.
Yes. And we're going to go on and talk about that in the second section.
Well, let's talk about the rest of the first section. By the way, I realized that when we paused before, I had completely forgot one of the things that I was going to bring up. It's not a particularly important thing. Like, I don't think it was that vital to anything else he was saying, but it's just like such a weird claim that I feel bad about letting it go by without commenting on it. Was that one of the first things Ben Shapiro said was that I think, he said there are good arguments for and against the existence of God, which is also weird because his stated position is that you can't prove it. And so he's not going to try. But, if he also thinks that, they're fairly formidable, that was the phrase he used, arguments on both sides, it's like, well, okay, well, I mean, even if you think you can't prove it in some absolute sense, that you can't, presumably you also don't think you can prove any of the things you care about politically that you spend most of your life on, right, in that absolute sense. But surely you think there are better and worse arguments, right? Like, so why not at least try to show that you have better arguments than, your opposition's arguments? But putting all that aside, he said, okay, there are fairly formidable arguments for it against the existence of God. But the thing that really makes a difference here is that most theists have entertained doubts, or that atheists haven't. Like like I said, I don't think it matters. It's just a really weird thing to claim, given that we do still live in a society where the vast majority of people do believe in God, and so most people grow up believing in it. If you're an atheist, more than likely, this is something you used to believe and have since discarded. Like it's very, like, just sociologically, it's actually not impossible, right? Clearly, right? They're, atheists have children, whatever. But but it's relatively unlikely on a broad statistical level that, that if you're an atheist, that, you've always been one.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's that claim like struck me as one of those things that like conservative, like religious people say to each other, like when they're having conversations, if you ever watch any of their content, where they're just like, yeah, of course. Like, how could an atheist like believe in that stuff? And then like, I mean, it's just a really weird thing to say that like struck me as one of those. But yeah, I mean, and then of course there's the escape hatch, right, happening here with the faith. And it's like, again, why even have this conversation if that's good? Like, again, the conversation that's on the screen there, right? The question, is religion good? I mean, that's more interesting than, or at least that has more potential for like some kind of,
right,
like I mean, I doubt it's necessarily going to be productive. Maybe it will be, but like more productive if you're just going to appeal to that like faith and mystery all the time.
Yeah, and again, it's very unclear why he thinks that that's more available to him. I mean, all he's really like it seems like all he's really got to go on there is that it's like traditional for religious people to appeal to faith and mystery, but he hasn't really given any reason to think it makes more sense, right? Like,
at least he admitted it's an escape hatch, though. I did appreciate that.
Yeah. Although in a weird way, that also
in a weird way,
but
it's just like I've seen so many like weird like Christians like debate and just like not admit that it's an escape hatch. They're just going to be like, what do you mean it's rational? And you're just like, what? Like, no, it's actually very much an argumentative escape hatch here. But yeah, you're right. He did kind of try to make a weird argument. Well, because the burden's not on me. And I didn't really quite understand that.
Yeah, I didn't understand that at all when he tried to make his argument for like why I can say this, but you can't, in terms of just like not explaining things because you have the burden. It's like, if anything, I feel like Ben Shapiro would have the stronger burden since he's positing like the extra entity. Like Ben Shapiro has like the less parsimonious view. So if anybody here has like a burden to show that their view better explains some data than the other view, it's going to be Ben Shapiro rather than Alex.
Yeah, that seems right. Yeah, sorry, you were saying?
No, that's all. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I also think 99% of the time that people use the phrase burden of proof when argued about sort of philosophical topics, it's misplaced, right? That I think there sort of isn't any such thing as a burden of proof. It's just not a very helpful concept. Like, I think I agree with your point that it's like look, given exactly equally balanced evidence, then there's a sort of obvious parsimony consideration to say, okay, like Alex has only postulated the existence of the stuff we're pretty sure about anyway, right? And you're saying there's this extra thing. So it's probably a simpler explanation to say that he's right. That's fair enough, right? But like, I don't know. I sort of suspect that, you know, like this whole concept, like the way that people throw around burden of proof, and this, by the way, I mean, look, I think Ben Shapiro has a fairly plausible, I learned it from you, you know, point to make here in arguing with online atheists, because like online atheists are definitely the ones who popularized this concept of a burden of proof in religious arguments. But I think they're just mistaken to do so, because it's like, look, I mean, really, what are you doing when you talk about a burden of proof? There's like some kind of implicit analogy to like a legal burden of proof, right? In a courtroom. And but the only reason there's a legal burden of proof is because, you know, there's only one person who's on trial, that there's like that you should, that, you know, there's only one person whose like life or liberty is at stake in the proceedings. And so, you know, there's this reason to err on the side of, like, a moral reason to err on the side of not taking away that life or liberty. But, you know, take that out of it. Like, I mean, if, you know, even if it's just like, look, we're trying to, you know, we're talking about, I don't know, do you think OJ Simpson killed his wife or not? And you're not an OJ Simpson murder jury. You're just a regular person. Then it's like, there is no burden of proof at that point, right? Like there's just like people try to figure out what they think is true. I mean, if somebody's, you know, and so certainly here, I mean, it's like, yeah, look, Ben Shapiro is asserting some things are true. Alex is asserting that some contrary things are true, right? The idea that there's some special burden of proof that one of them has, the other doesn't, I just don't understand that at all. So, and that seemed to be like, Ben like floated that for a second as like his reason for thinking that that Alex wasn't allowed to default to mystery like he was. But then his other reason just seemed to be that's like, well, it's the foundation of my philosophy or whatever, that it's like, oh, this is traditionally a thing that God people believe about God. It's like, okay, but like that doesn't by itself add up to a good reason to think that makes sense, or that's like, or that's any more coherent than it would be for an atheist to just be like, I don't know, I think free will and morality and truth and reason exist. And, you know, it feels like they do. It's a big mystery, but, you know, I still accept it, right? Like I don't. It still seems like there's a parity there. That
and then like, if we get enough atheists to believe that for a long enough time, then we'll have the same standing as Ben Shapiro.
Yeah, exactly. And yeah, so it seems like, you know, the thing about the self just seemed like more of what we were talking about the last time we paused, that, you know, that he sort of tried to raise this sort of deep philosophical problem about, okay, is the self persist, you know, is like a human person more than, you know, said a meatball, you know, floating through space. That's kind of suggestive. It's not totally clear what it means, but whatever. Like he's gesturing in the general region of like a bundle of real problems, right? Like even if he's being very imprecise about which problem he has in mind, right? Like is this more free will stuff? Is this more morality stuff? Is this about the actual persistence of a person over time, right? Like it's sort of seems like maybe a little bit of all three, but like whatever. Like again, gesturing in a bundle of real problems, but like even once you acknowledge that the problems exist, it doesn't follow that they're somehow more tractable once you insert the premise that God exists. I mean, it's like he hasn't done anything to even show that is a possibly relevant premise, right? Like let's, you know, start with a universe where there are meatballs floating through space who, you know, who are sentient and, you know, think that they're acting morally and all that stuff, but they're mistaken because they're really just meatballs floating through space, whatever that means. Start with that universe, add an all-powerful, morally perfect being. Is it still true? You know, is like if that morally perfect being had created a bunch of things that were molecule by molecule exactly like those meatballs floating through space, would those not just be meatballs floating through space? If so, why not? Right? Like, how would he have to create them? in order for them not to be meatballs for floating through space, but really persons and whatever, whatever meaning he attaches to them. And again, it just seems like the same as the free will problem. It's like, well, just first tell me what you think the state of the universe would have to be in order for this not to be true. And then give me a reason why God would have to exist for the universe to be in that state. Right? Like, because it just, and if you say, well, it's a big mystery, I have no idea what state it is. Well, okay, if you have no idea what state it is, then you have no idea whether we're in it. Right? Like, because it seems like you'd have to answer that question in order to even have an opinion about the other one. And then the only other thing I wanted to comment on is just when he's in the earlier part of what we just watched, when he's going to, he's going back to the free will stuff. It just seems like Ben is throwing together a lot of different issues. He talks about how, because when he's going on about how most people, and, by the way, very condescending argument that like, I mean, this is kind of like, there's a line in Trotsky's memoir where he talks about some like Tsarist official who, I don't remember who was at like the school that he went to or like whatever he's talking to, who was like, yeah, look, I've read Darwin, but I'd like I understand this, but the peasants, right? They need a religion, right? That's like, it's like he's essentially doing the same thing. Then it's like, oh, look, Alex is an intelligent man. He can have his worldview and not just like go into despair about like, all the dum-dums out there, right? They need to believe what I believe, but even aside from that, just on the substance of the view, he's like talking about all the things that people need to believe that they're not going to believe if they don't believe in free will. It seems like most of them don't have anything to do with free will. Like he says, people have to believe they can change themselves. It's like, okay, but look, there's no reason that not believing in free will would mean that you don't think that like moral reform exists, right? That there are people who change their character. I mean, it's uncontroversially, there are people who change their character. Like you could, like, of course there are, right? There, people who are, gang members who go into prison and, find God and this and that and come out and, counsel former gang members when they get out, right? Like nobody denies that exists. The question is, are they making a free choice or was that, decision unfree? Right? Like that's a controversial issue, but it's not controversial that those people exist. So it's like, I don't know what that's supposed to have to do with free will. And he says, make a difference in the world. It's like, again, nobody,
Yeah. Like what's the contradiction between saying like, oh, like free will doesn't exist in the sense required for moral responsibility, so all of our practices of like praising and blaming people for their actions, those are all kind of normatively inappropriate. Like what's the contradiction between that and like still thinking that like your deliberation and actions can be causally efficacious and that you can have good reasons to engage in certain actions, etc. Like you just kind of like implied that there's some tension between those claims. I just don't see it.
Yeah, exactly. Like I think what you said is exactly right, that because there are real things he could have brought up here, right? He could have like pointed out ways in which we praise people, blame people, hold, like that might genuinely not make sense without that assumption, right? Because like clearly we think that certain kinds of lack of control really are exculpatory. And, people don't deserve blame or merit praise, if they are not acted in control of their actions in those ways, right? So there actually is like a genuine problem about, well, hold on, how much of those practices do we need to rethink if we don't believe in free will? People like, Spinoza, right, who don't believe in it will actually like grapple with those questions, or like Dirk Pereboom, right? That's a contemporary philosopher who doesn't believe in free will and knows what he's talking about. And, and like he has interesting things to say about it, where he's like grappling with this question. He understands these are real questions. These practices that really do revolve around praise and blame might not make sense if you don't think that people are truly responsible for their actions, that you don't think they have the right kind of control for that. But like all the stuff Ben Shapiro was saying, that like, oh, people have to believe they can change themselves. People have to believe they can make a difference in the world. People have to believe they can make decisions for the good or the bad. It's like, yeah, all that stuff is fine. None of that's threatened. Like none of that's threatened by free will not existing. So, I think you're just barking up the wrong tree there.
Yeah, no, yeah, totally. It was like the only like other thing I can think of is like that was confusing about what Ben Shapiro said with respect to free will is like he seemed to imply that like the notion of the self kind of necessarily implies the existence of free will. It's like not clear why that would be the case. Like those seem like kind of distinct concepts, like the concept of the self and the concept of being free. Because he was like, why would an atheist believe in a self? Because the self is by definition like a determinate, uncaused, kind of like libertarianly free will kind of entity. And it's like, it seems perfectly coherent to say something like Josh is a person and Josh is not free in the sense required for moral responsibility. In fact, like there's lots of cases where like there are people, like even people who are like compatibilists or who believe in free will aren't going to say that everybody has free will. Like on any plausible view, there are going to be actually existing persons who don't have free will. So clearly it's not like a necessary condition.
Yeah, I mean, like there are people who nobody thinks have free will, right? Like, I mean, like if people who are like severely mentally ill and act on the basis of that, or who have like seem to lack the right cognitive capacities. In fact, I actually think that's kind of a problem for certain incompatibilist notions of free will, that like if they think that the big thing that makes us be free is that there's like an immaterial soul that's like having this miraculous relationship with the external physical world, it's not clear why that wouldn't be the case with these categories of people, right? But whatever, putting that aside, I mean, part of the sort of anybody who does believe in free will in whatever sense of free will, part of the data that they're working with intuitively is that there are some people who seem to be free and there are other people who seem to be unfree, right? So
Ben, what do you mean? There's an easy answer to that question. I mean, it's obviously just the devil taking hold of them.
Okay. Yeah. Fair enough. And we know when that's happening, of course.
Obviously.
Yeah, because that's like, it's also, by the way, notice that he's not just like, Ben is kind of tried to rely on the tradition of theists saying that the features of God are mysterious, but he's trying to sort of say, oh, see, we have a proud tradition of thinking things are mysterious, therefore I can think all this other stuff is mysterious. It's like, well, none of that follows from the God part, right? Like you can think that the features of God are mysterious, but like still understand how free will or morality or truth or any of these other concepts he's invoking work, right? Like it just, it seems like his argument as well, I'm willing to admit mysteriousness. So like anytime I run into problems with the concept, I could just say, oh, it's mysterious.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And he's kind of relying on this, it's kind of I feel like it's kind of a common tactic in these kinds of debates from theists to just like problematize naturalism. And that's kind of what he did at the beginning of the debate, right? Yeah. And like, just be like, try to show how naturalism's incoherent for all these different reasons. And then like the moment he gets challenged, he's like, well, I mean, I don't claim to know how God works. And it's like, okay, well, what's the point of this then?
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like, because you're not like, if you're going to say, the atheist naturalist has this problem that the theist doesn't. Okay. But that's a comparative judgment, right? Like what you have to do is compare two things, right? Like how the atheist or the atheist naturalist or, whatever this argument, whatever combination of arguments this position is directed against, how they fare with regard to this problem, and then how you do, right? And if at a crucial point you say, oh, it's actually a huge mystery on my worldview how this works, it's like, well, then I don't know how well you could explain it, right? You have to clear up the mystery first. And then, because right now it just kind of seems like what you're saying is I can't explain it either, but that's not a problem. It's like, I don't know. Like,
well, I don't need to explain it because lots of people who think what I think also don't explain it. It's like, seems to be the justification.
Yeah, exactly.
I had free will to ask any of the questions I've had written down here, but I just didn't want to. I didn't want to stop either of you. It's been breathless and captivating. I'm sure you'll agree. Before we go to our first break, we are going to go on and talk about society and how morality undergirds society and civilization.
May I just say, but just I know we're coming to the end of the section. Just to close off this moment, that if people listening agree with me that free will in fact doesn't exist, and simultaneously agree with you that free will is somehow necessary for the upkeep of civilization, then I would simply ask them to consider who's relying on the delusion here.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that as an insult, but you see what I'm saying, right?
I totally agree. And so for my argument, you would be, and from your argument, I would be.
Yeah.
Meaning, I think that you are delusional. There's no free will, and you think I'm delusional in the sense that there is no free will, and yet I believe in it.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So for you, Alex, just before we go to the break, then, because we're trying to break it down, we've got two insane minds here, really kind of grappling, and I feel as I've won a prize in a competition just to be here sitting with you both. To break it down for
Well, in fact,
the viewers, Alex, would you say that free will is maybe, if there is no such thing as free will, is it nevertheless a helpful fiction for people, a convenient narrative that we can cling to sort of bat away despair?
Precisely why it evolved, in my view. I think I totally understand that, but because it evolved so strongly, I will say that we are all, if we are sort of delusory in our belief in free will. I mean, you're quite right in saying that I act as if free will exists in the sense of not constantly being aware that it doesn't. I don't wake up and do those strange morning affirmations that you mentioned into the mirror about, the sort of heat death of the universe. But
maybe you should.
People, I think it is good to reflect on your mortality in that manner every once in a while, and it does inspire some serious thought about whether you're really taking your philosophy seriously. But I will say that the mechanism is so useful and has been so successful in embedding itself into our psyche that we cannot shake it off. So I can I can have conversations with people, as I do regularly, talking about the existence of free will, and they come away saying, you know what, that's extraordinary. Maybe you're right about this. And nothing about the way they live their life changes, precisely because of the fact that the very argument I'm making relies on the assumption that we will still be driven by our drives. All I'm doing is identifying what's actually going on there, in my view. It doesn't actually change what happens or what the brain indeed does.
So the utility argument for what you're saying about free will is that the main utility in you saying these things is for people not to believe you in the end.
We are predetermined to go to a break at this point. So we're going to continue this. You're watching and listening to the big conversation from Premier Unbelievable with me, your host. Welcome back to the big conversation from Premier Unbelievable with me, your host, Andy Kind. Today, our topic is religion. Is it good or bad for society? And I've been joined by Ben Shapiro and Alex O'Connor. And in the first section, we basically solved the problem of free will. That's done. No one need write on that ever again. So congratulations. That's another credit for you.
Yeah, I think on the delusion point, we terminated in something like, and I know you are, but what am I?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. And my dad can beat up your dad's. So let's move on in this section to talking about another easily solved question, morality and its role in society. So, Alex, we started with Ben in the first section. Let's start with you. What for you makes an outcome good or bad? And feel free to break that down, define things as you want. And how do we determine what is good and acceptable in society?
Here is where I may disappoint you and potentially excite Mr. Shapiro in that I don't have a good answer to that question. Okay. In that, obviously, attempts have been made for a long time to ground good outside of God. I must say that similarly to rehash the same theme, I think there are issues with grounding good in God as well. I don't think that removes the problem. I don't quite know what good is, if it indeed exists. I'm quite suspicious of the concept. I think it might be another one of these unfortunately quite nihilistic evolutionary sort of illusions of a sort. I guess I ascribe to emotivism more than anything, which has sort of gone out of fashion in the past decade, but I think still has some truth to it in a sense. It's more of a philosophy of language than it is a philosophy of what good and bad actually is. What I do know, however, is that there are problems, I think, with trying to ground morality in the existence of a God, especially if it's done so on the grounds that it essentially can't be done anywhere else. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, the religions of the world are false. I think that they are incorrect. That is, I don't think there really is a supernatural authority. And what that means is that the inventions of religious morality are just those inventions, and inventions of a human mind. Now, if you have a human morality that recognizes that it is essentially a series of compromises between the history of mankind trying to get along with each other on a planet, then what happens is sometimes these ideas and these philosophies rub up against the real world, and we can adapt them as necessary. Now, there is a deep problem with this, and that is, if I meet a man who wants to kill me or a friend, and he says that he doesn't believe in God. There's very little I can do to talk him out of that, except I can threaten him with legal sanction. I can threaten him with moral reproach, exclusion from the moral community, but there's not much more I can do. However, if a person says that he wants to kill me, and he believes that he wants to kill me because God has told him to do so, then I don't even have that minimal reproach available to me, because there is no law written by any man of any time that could ever count one iota against the dictates of the creator of the universe. Therefore, if that God in fact does not exist, and if these moralities are in fact human inventions, then what you have in the grounding of an ethical system in the dictates, allegedly, of the creator of the universe is all of the arbitrariness and subjectivity and failure and faults of nihilism and human invented morality, with all of the certainty and all of the faith and all of the unanswerability of the creator of the universe. That to me seems a dangerous cocktail that we drink at our peril.
So many things there, and so much that you're saying is quite brilliant. I actually thought you were going in a different direction with that last example, which I'll explain in a second. So, to start with the very beginning, obviously, the idea of right and wrong. So there are many problems with the motivism. Alistair McIntyre does a good job sort of breaking down the problems with the motivism. But the sort of idea that there have to be certain moral absolutes that are beyond contention, and those moral absolutes have to be universally accepted. You can ground that, I suppose, in a sort of descriptive universe. The problem is that, to go back to your example, which again I think is a really interesting one, if a man comes to kill me, I think the real question of religion versus non-religion in the utility sphere here is it more likely that a man is going to come to kill you being a devotee of a religion that says that he must kill you? Or is it more likely that a man is going to kill you out of self-interest because he is not a devotee of a God who says that killing is wrong? So if you are faced with these two alternatives, to kind of remove your example one step, the question is why the man has come to kill you. I mean, that's your premise is the man has come to kill you because God told him to, and so he can't be dissuaded by force. Agreed. We see that full scale in the real world on a fairly regular basis. It is also true that over the course of human history, men have come to kill one another on the basis of self-interest in extraordinary amounts of the time. Tribal self-interest, particularly, having no particular relationship with God, just the idea that I want to kill you over territory, I want to kill you over resources, I want to kill you because you're not a member of my immediate kin family, or because you killed a member of my kin family, and so in revenge, I need to kill a member of your kin family. The entire, to borrow from your language, the entire sort of evolution of religion on a utility basis would have been to create moral absolutes that are applicable more broadly than to you and your friends. Any morality that can be created on an individual level is inherently dangerous because you can immediately graft that morality onto your personal self-interest. The entire purpose of religion, whether you want to ground that in evolutionary brain functionings, or whether you want to ground that in revelation, the entire purpose of religion on a utility level is to remove morality from the purview of my special interest and to say, here are things that I cannot do, even if they are in my interest, because there is a higher power that says I cannot do these things. I think that a society that does not have these moral absolutes is in deep trouble. A society that refuses to say that there are certain absolutes that cannot be crossed under any circumstances that are universally applicable, it reduces things that we all take for granted, like equal justice before the law, like the idea that the law is supposed to equally apply to everybody, whether they're a member of your family or whether they're not. And there are broad cultural differences in these questions. I mean, to pretend that all human societies have equality under law is obviously not true. It's not even remotely true, actually. There's a very good book called The Weirdest People in the World, all about the idea that we in the West have this sort of ethnocentric view of ourselves where we think everybody thinks like people in the West. But the truth is that because we are Western educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, we have particular views of the world. Those views are drawn from a particularistic tradition. That particularistic tradition is biblical in nature. I mean, it is Judeo-Christian in nature, even if you're just describing European society or American society, historically speaking. So the kind of removal of God from the equation, your suggestion is that God makes a person impervious to countervailing responses. And my answer is yes, God does make a person impervious to countervailing responses, including the evils of one's own heart, if you truly believe that God is standing above you, telling you not to do that thing. And again, social science tends to bear this out. People who believe that God is above them tend to give more charity, for example. People who tend to live inside religious communities, within the religious community. And I'm not going to pretend that I think all religions are equivalent in their truth propositions, because I don't. I mean, if I did, I wouldn't be wearing a yarmulke, right? So That's just what it is. Inside religious communities, a lot of social bonds and a lot of social frameworks are built on the basis of this shared belief system. In other words, diversity itself, self-interest, cannot always check self-interest, and it tends to tear apart societies and communities unless there is an orienting goal. That orienting goal traditionally has been performed by church. It's been traditionally performed by the idea that you are serving God together. And because of that, people build these social bonds, including the institutions of police, for example, to prevent people from killing each other, because we now all agree that killing is wrong. So we ought to have a third party that we can actually give the power to stop that killing. So again, I think that the question of utility here is one of whether you think that the chief danger is that people are going to believe in a God who tells them to kill in God's name, or whether you think that the chief danger is in man's own heart, and that man is going to be driven by his own self-interest to commit murder and then call it something else.
I think it's all very well and good when this religious tradition is protecting what you think is good. But as we know, it can do the exact opposite, and it can do so with the same force.
Sure.
And I suppose the question we have to ask is whether this is a worthwhile trade-off. That is to say, that there may be some social utility in putting our fundamental ethical assumptions outside of the realm of debate. But when those ethical statements begin to inspire what we would probably consider to be less than socially cohesive behavior, there is nothing you can do, nothing to talk people out of them, precisely because that's where they've placed them. And that seems dangerous to me. And it seems for example, a lot of people talk about how religion can make people happier. It can make people more socially cohesive. It can promote people to start families and have children. This is true of most religions. This is also true of Islam, which I'm not sure you would want to say. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I'm not sure you'd want to say as a force for good in the world. I don't think, in other words, that it's always a worthwhile trade-off. Now,
I agree with you, by the way.
Just because you mentioned how the sort of culture of Europe and its success and America is indebted to Christianity. I mean, this is of course true in a sense, but there's been a recent revival, it seems. I don't really know quite how it's happened. I think it's got a lot to do with Tom Holland, maybe. That's the historian, not the superhero.
Not Spider-Man.
This idea that
Although
actually
he's good too. He's a good
actually
guy.
the great, I wonder what he would have to say on all of this. The Western civilization sort of depends and should be in gratitude to a religious tradition because it provided this kind of ethical framework in which this could have arisen. We hear about the scientific enlightenment. We hear about the grounding of ethics and God, the creation of natural rights, as if these things weren't established in resistance all the way along to the religious tradition. A society that today, I'll expand on this if you like, a society today that decides that religion throughout its history has been wrong about the position of women in society, wrong about the mortal fate of practicing homosexuals, wrong about the position of the earth in relation to the sun, wrong about the age of both of those celestial bodies, wrong about the common evolutionary ancestry of every animal, including the human animal on planet Earth, wrong about the ownership of other human beings as private property. Now has to contend with a religious tradition that doesn't come to us with contrition and apology and say, well, maybe we were wrong about these things. But no, these are all our things after all. We're going to claim these things. That is, I know that St. Paul says, I suffer not a woman to teach, nor to usurp authority over a man. Rather, she should remain silent. For Adam was formed first, then Eve. And that man is the glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. But don't you know that the social justice movement is essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I know that the Old Testament not only explicitly condones the ownership of other human beings as private property, but gives detailed instructions about exactly how to buy and indeed take them, sometimes including as sexual property. But don't you know that the abolitionist movement was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? Yes, I know that Galileo was shown the instruments of torture by the Inquisition for having the temerity to suggest that the Earth might orbit the sun rather than the other way around. But don't you know that the scientific revolution, which he authored, was essentially Judeo-Christian in origin? I'd find it funny if it wasn't so offensive to the people who established these very developments against the very religious traditions that now want to claim them as their own.
Okay, so I would buy that, except for the fact that many of the people that you mentioned in these contexts explicitly counted themselves as religious believers and were speaking in the name of the religion while they were doing it. So to take the abolitionist movement as an example, I mean, William Wilberforce, obviously a tremendously religious person and a big believer in the New Testament. Isaac Newton, obviously deeply ensconced in the New Testament, right? Yeah, certainly important to the scientific revolution. The point about religion, and this is why when I wrote my book, what I have to name the title now and plug myself because that's the way
You
that
got
it
to
works.
wave
The right
around
side of, the right side of
camera.
history. But the reason that I talked about how reason and moral purpose made the West is because I think that one of the fundamental precepts of at least Judeo-Christian religion is that when God gives a text or a set of ideas to human beings, he expects us to use our reason to apply to those texts. And so the sort of evolution of interpretation is part of the religious tradition. I mean, that's always been the case in my religion anyway. So I can only, I always hesitate to speak on behalf of other people's religions because I don't know them nearly as well as I know my own. So when I talk about sort of the application of reason to tradition in the religious tradition, obviously we have books and books and books of texts discussing and debating these very ideas. And the idea of religious debate has always been central to the idea of Judeo-Christian religion. And when it hasn't been, it's been seen as repressive and has spawned then other Christian movements that then argue with the original movement and end up generating in almost Hegelian fashion some new form of interpretation. The point that I'm making is that outside that framework, it doesn't exist. Meaning that once if the argument is over interpretation of particular biblical verses in a context in which there is a God who puts certain moral precepts beyond human judgment, those arguments you can have without threatening the entire social structure. What is very difficult is to have a social structure at all in the absence of fundamental moral precepts that are presupposed by everyone. And I think one of the reasons that you're seeing a sort of revival of this idea that religion is very important to the West is because one of the things that we have seen is that as religion has become less important to the West, we've seen declining birth rates en masse. We've seen rises in suicidal ideation. We've seen, especially over the last 10 years, tremendous individual atomization, certainly an extraordinary amount of less social connection, right? All of these things are things that frankly used to be provided by church and these social institutions that, again, were oriented toward a single purpose. So when you talk about the idea that, I'm going to put aside the free will discussion because I think, again, it's easy to get caught up in the reversion to the argument that I was making before when you were saying that, can you argue the man out of stabbing you? To use your framework, I mean, you can't argue him out of doing anything. I mean, you're going to say words, the words are going to have an impact, but you can't argue him out of doing anything. But not to get back into a topic that we've handled, free will is done.
I'm not gonna answer that.
So I think he actually looks like they're going to skip past this way too fast, but I think Ben actually added another concept to the list of things that he's arbitrarily claiming are easier to make sense of if you believe in God, or maybe even that you can't make sense of unless you believe in God, but you can if you do. None of which he's given any sort of argument for theism helping with in any way, shape, or form, right? But so we already had free will, morality, persistent self, truth. I guess he said reason earlier, but now we're really seeing a little bit more what he means by it, right? Because I think he just said, given Alex's worldview, you can't argue somebody out of something. You could just say words and then maybe they'll do things. So it's like that. I think he's suggested that those words don't constitute arguments if God doesn't exist, but I have no idea what the link between those is supposed to be.
Yeah, that's a very bizarre claim. Arguments require God.
Why would that be?
Yeah.
Just on the face of it, those two things seem like, very different things. So this is like a little bit frustrating because for like half a second at the beginning of this last chunk we watched, Alex, I think, sort of very vaguely gestured in the direction of Euthyphro type issues when he said, "Oh, I think there are problems with grounding morality in God," but he didn't like explain what he meant by it, and Ben just ignored it. So like we never actually got to see what Ben Shapiro would have done in response to the Euthyphro problem, but it seems like. It seems like Alex sort of said a few things about his own ethical views, which of course, there are tons of atheists who are very strong moral realists of different kinds, right? That's, completely separate issue, right? The one has nothing to do with the other. But, he said a few things about his own metaethical views, and Ben Shapiro, sort of gestured at, the McIntyre against emotivism, and, but really they moved on very, very quickly to the consequentialist question, right? Like, is it is it like beneficial for society, for for people, like, are people more or less likely to act immorally, given belief in God? And Alex said, oh, well, if somebody's coming to kill me, maybe I could argue them out of it unless they believe in God, in which case, unless they believe that God has told them to do this, in which case there's nothing I could do to argue them out of it, which, by the way, I don't know about that, but whatever. Like, putting that aside, Ben Shapiro responded by saying, oh, but like, sure, I agree with you. If somebody's coming to kill you, then, and they think that God has sent them to do that, then, they're less likely to be argued out of it than anybody's coming to kill you for other reasons. But then, like, the real question is somebody more likely to come to kill you because they believe that God wants them to, or are they more likely to kill you because they believe that there is no God and thus everything is permitted, right? Like, basically, that seemed to be his point. It's like, well, look, if you're going to put those in those terms, like, look, clearly, as I think Ben has even acknowledged in other points of this debate, there are lots of, atheists who have strongly held moral views, right? So, like, at this point, it's just a statistical question. Are you more likely to have a, everything is permitted nihilistic view about morality if you're an atheist? And, the best, I'd like to see some stats on that, right?
I'm sure there's something exists. It'd be interesting to find out, actually, because there's got to be stats on like likelihood to like commit crime or something if you're like a religious believer versus an atheist somewhere, probably.
Yeah, I mean, certainly one. This is a very rough proxy, but I looked it up during that because I was just curious about it. The 5 countries in the world that have the largest percentage of atheists are Japan, Vietnam, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. And so I just looked it up real quick, and the out of those 5 countries that have more atheists than any other countries, in the one that has,
and those places are crime riddled, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the one that has the highest murder rate of the 5 is Vietnam, which is not very surprising because it's a third world country. Much more poverty. That has about 1.3 homicides per 100,000.
Also, their stats on atheists might be distorted because isn't that like a communist dictatorship? I could be wrong about that. Where they artificially like say the population is like, held up to some atheist Marxism or something.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, they have a I don't know. I guess I don't know how good the Vietnam religious view stats are, but certainly the other 4, Japan, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, I think all of those, it's like none of those are even as high as like 1 per 100,000 homicide rate. They're all like 0.5 or 0.7. Most of them are closer to 0.5. The United States is like 7 per 100,000, and it's like the most religious country in the first world, right? So, it's I think that the way more religious on average than most of those weird societies that Ben is talking about.
It's interesting that I don't know the person in the chat, the comment they just said, that's the thing that I don't know if this person's conservative because they say budding anarchist. So, but social cohesion is important, right? I feel like that's a classic thing that I think Americans, conservatives tend to, I'm not saying that this person's a conservative, will appeal to, right? Whenever you talk about how good, social outcomes are in these countries. And I guess the thing that just occurred to me that's interesting is like one of the things that Ben Shapiro is talking about right now about like what's so bad about the loss of religion. So the fact that when you have no religion, there's no social cohesion anymore. So like, obviously it's not Shapiro making this point, it's just someone in the chat, but it's just interesting to me that it seems like, if our argument for why there's so little crime in these countries is because they're so socially cohesive, it's kind of interesting because that suggests that maybe atheism is not necessarily connected with a lack of social cohesion.
Totally. Now, to be fair, the person budding anarchist unless I've somehow really got my wires crossed, I know exactly who that is, and they're not a conservative. But
Yeah, I didn't think so. Most people wouldn't describe themselves as an anarchist if they're a conservative.
But in any case, yeah, look, I think that's right. And to be clear, I mean, I don't think I certainly wouldn't argue that like the places with the most atheists are less murdery than the most religious, country in the Western world, the global North, maybe, that they have like, because of the atheism. I actually think that'd be very silly, right? Like I just think that clearly the atheism doesn't like
totally
make people more murdery. I mean, I think that by and large, I think that like obviously for at least a few of those countries, probably a more relevant distinction is that they've got like really strong unions and massive welfare states, so they're like more egalitarian societies. And I think there are lots of reasons why that would make the murder rate lower. But but clearly the atheism itself is not, a sufficient condition for making people deciding that everything is permitted and start murdering each other. Yeah, you're saying.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Like that kind of connects to this. Like it seems like one thing that Ben Shapiro is kind of doing, this argumentative move that he's making, is basically like, oh, well, because religion has this effect, or it serves this role, or it has traditionally served this role, therefore we should keep it around, which seems to implicitly assume that like just because it's played this role, there's nothing else, like no other mechanism that could replace it to play the same role. Like if he's like, oh, well, religion is necessary for social cohesion and it's necessary to motivate people to act morally. It's like, the things that you were just mentioning, like robust like welfare states and community institutions, things like that can play these same roles. And, even if like, I guess Ben Shapiro can argue that like, well, empirically, it's often the case that these kind of institutions don't replace religion when religion goes away. But like, that's empirically questionable. And also, even if that was true, is that an argument for we should keep religion around, or is that an argument for we should be doing more to find replacements for religion than we are currently,
Yeah, I'd also, just point out that like, it's really absurd when he starts talking about social atomization. It's like, I'm not denying that, obviously, like if you go to church every week, etc., right, that could like, play a role in countering atomization. So like if that declines, that doesn't help, right? Like that's true enough, right? But like, also, come on, man. I mean, this is like, no, this stuff is mostly downstream of the economic policies that you support, right? That's the neoliberalism. That if people are working 3 jobs and they and also you have this whole the stuff that like, yes, granted, very annoyed YIMBY urbanists are always talking about, but doesn't mean they're wrong, right? About the sort of general decline of third places, right? There's the home, work, and then the third place where you spend a lot of time, right? That they I don't see any mechanism whereby like atheism did that, right? That's something that happened because people aren't religious, right? That means that like that's why they don't have a neighborhood bar that they hang out in, right? Like that's be very unclear what the cause and effect connection would be there. Also, so he brought up Ben Shapiro brought up the all caps weird concept, right? From Joseph Henrich. I don't know how I'm not sure. And look, I don't want to speak out of turn here because this is not research I know a ton about, and I'm not going to pretend to. But I would note that only the first letter of that acronym is one that, like, plausibly the sort of legacy of the Bible is going to play any role in, the Western part, right? The rest of it is educated, industrial, rich, and democratic, which are all very recent developments historically, right? That like mass education, super recent development, right? Even at like a primary school level, Industrialization, obviously, lagging only the last few centuries, democracy, very recent, all of these are things that have, that are very recent historical developments. And also they all coincide with the decline of religiosity, right? That this is, I'm not claiming causation, but, I'm just saying those are all things that are correlated with the decline in religiosity. And, some of them might be causally related to it, but whatever, put that aside. Like, that's so like saying, I think that when Ben is reaching for that, he's trying to make a connection that doesn't quite make sense, right? They're saying like, look, to the extent that like people in, weird societies might have moral intuitions that are different from other people in other kinds of societies, just by the stipulation, most of that has nothing to do with religion, right? Because it's because of features that have not existed for the overwhelming majority of what Ben keeps calling Judeo-Christian history. And by the way, like, that's such a funny phrase, Judeo-Christian. Like, come on, like, nobody before World War II used Judeo-Christian, right? This is something that, like, liberal Christians who were enlightened enough to feel bad about the Holocaust basically started using that phrase. Like, oh, look, Judaism, Christianity, it's all basically the same thing. 99% of Christian history, nobody was using the phrase Judeo-Christian. I was, sort of my kind of standing joke about this is I always thought it was a shame that, like, when I read his book, they keep referring to the right side of history, I remember thinking, like, it's like he uses this phrase so much, and it's so arbitrary and silly because he clearly means to leave out Islam. In fact, that's like the main thing he means to leave out. But like, when you're leaving that out, like, what meaningfully do Judaism and Christianity have in common that they don't have in common with Islam? Like, nothing, right? Like that's everything you can say about that, right? You can say about Islam. So yeah, it's so like, so the thing I kept joking about when I was like reading that book, it's like, man, it's such a shame that Ben Shapiro didn't grow up in some nice Episcopalian family so he could just say Christian, because it's like clearly the word that would fit best 99.9 times out of 100 that he uses Judeo-Christian. And then, yeah, I guess my last point about this before going back to you guys, just that it seems, I think it's like a little bit, I actually think the best point that Alex has probably made, certainly in this part of the debate, is that all of the stuff that there's all this stuff that, Ben wants, it's related to the point about weirdness, right? That Ben wants to attribute to religion that, is actually stuff that clearly is correlated with the, like with the Industrial Revolution and, the spread of Enlightenment philosophy and etc. And I think it's a much weaker point than Ben realizes it is, that people who come out of historically a very Christian society at points when you have these larger trends that are like driving dramatic changes in moral beliefs from what people had believed for the vast majority of Christian history, that of course they would like phrase their objections in Christian terms, because like that's how changing societies, that's how changing cultures work, right? That you try to justify the new stuff in the language of the old stuff, right? This is the Marx thing in the 18th Brumaire about the how revolutionary change always comes wearing the costumes of the old older social forms. But like, just it's like, yeah, of course, yeah, people in the 19th century, 18th century, even when more people are starting to question slavery, right, people are going to frame their objections to slavery in Christian terms, even though the Bible clearly sanctions slavery. But like, fine, of course that makes sense. They come out of a Christian culture, so when they have new beliefs, they're going to express their new beliefs, in Christian terms. But the better question is, why did it take until then for you to get people on a mass scale questioning slavery? Like, what else changed? Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of
yeah.
I don't know, just like kind of a general like observation. Like, going into the debate, I was kind of wondering, like, okay, like, is this going to be a sort of like armchair debate about how can we metaphysically ground all these concepts without God, or is this going to be like an empirical debate about, you know, what are the effects of believing this on society? And then it, you know, it kind of turns out that it's actually like an armchair empirical debate where like they're arguing about the latter question but not really going deep into any sort of like systematic empirical evidence, which is, I guess, a little disappointing, but you know.
Yeah, right. Because it's like which is why, you know, this is why I think, like, unless you're going to have probably a much more boring but much more informative debate between two social scientists, you should probably skip the question of whether it's socially beneficial and just argue about whether it's true.
Yeah, right. It's weird. It's kind of jarring that it seems like they keep going back and forth where, like, you know, Alex is like, oh, well, I'm kind of an emotivist and here's my account of morality on a godless worldview. And, you know, I would like to see that part explored a bit more. But it's like they're going back and forth between like these kind of like metaphysical questions and then like, yeah, I guess these consequentialist questions. It's a bit strange.
Yeah, exactly. And I think they'd almost have to, given the framing, right? Because, like, again, like, I don't know how much either of these guys really, I mean, it's like you kind of pick any two random guys and, like, say, you know, do you think religion is socially beneficial? And I don't know that they would be able to come up with anything more than what we've gotten, you know, anything less than we've gotten here, right? Because it's like, yeah, just, I don't know. It all just kind of seems like trading hunches. I mean, if that's really the question you're interested in, then it's like, yeah, I don't know. Just like, bring me some numbers. Like,
it's like they both seem to have like sort of these like mechanistic speculations or like intuitions where Alex is like, oh, well, God might make somebody who wants to do bad things more emboldened to do bad things. And Ben Shapiro's like, oh, well, you know, believing in God might make somebody who wants to do good things more emboldened to do good things. And it's like, which of these mechanisms prevail? Like, I don't know. This is why we have social science.
Yeah, exactly.
Like,
yeah, I don't know. Right. Like, yeah, just like that's just an empirical question, right? Which of those is more likely? And, you know, I mean, whatever. I mean, for the record, I'm like a little bit skeptical that either of these are really that efficacious, right? I think that, like, Ben Shapiro had a moment of lucidity when he started talking about, you know, people doing things because of like tribal motivations and stuff like that. And it's like, yeah, totally. But also notice that historically, the vast majority of people who did it for those reasons were not atheists, right? Like, and so clearly their belief in God didn't stop them from acting that way, right? Like, if anything, you just came up with some religious rationalizations for it. But, like, yeah, look, both of, I mean, I totally agree with your core point. Both of these are mechanisms that could operate to some extent in the real world. There's no way to rule that out, right? Of course they could, right? Like, just, you know, but like there's also no way to know from the armchair, right? Which one has more effect in the real world. So yeah, exactly. Okay, well, we should probably go to the post game since we are right about at 10 Eastern right now. So let's do that. So if you are a patron, you should already have the post game link. If you are not a patron, I mean, I only assume that that's because you have a bleak and nihilistic worldview and you don't understand. You know, like you don't you don't understand how you should be related to your fellow creatures. So just, I don't know, man. I really hope you get it together. But no, if you can support, we certainly appreciate the support. Access to those Monday and Thursday post games and the Discord server and et cetera, always saying thank you. But mostly it's a way of keeping it going if you like what we're doing here. So do consider doing that. Patreon.com/Ben Burgis. If you are a patron, you should already have the link. And we will see you over in the post game in just a moment. Left is best.